What if Emperor Palpatine went crazy after fighting Mace Windu? What would happen then? Let's find out. Our story begins in the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, 5 years after the Clone Wars. The towering spires of the Imperial Palace loomed ominously over Coruscant, a fitting backdrop for the madness festering within. The once glorious structure, designed to inspire fear and obedience, now echoed with the pitiful, deranged screams of the Emperor himself. Sidious, the Dark Lord of the Sith, had been reduced to a shell of his former self, his mind shattered by the very power he had once wielded so effortlessly. The relentless assault of his own lightning all those years ago had left more than just physical scars. It had corroded his mind, warping his thoughts into a paranoid frenzy. Now Palpatine was bedridden, his shrill voice echoing through the halls of the palace, screaming incessantly about the Jedi taking over, as if they were still lurking in every shadow. The Dark Lord's influence had waned, but his iron grip on the Empire remained. His twisted orders, born from paranoia, had left the Empire in a state of disarray. It was Darth Vader who had summoned his secret meeting in the dead of night to discuss the Emperor's condition with the Empire's most loyal. The following was the urgent order Vader sent to Tarkin and Thrawn, summoning them to a war room in the Imperial Palace for this critical meeting. The Emperor's condition had become untenable, and something had to be done before the Empire descended into chaos. Grand Admiral Thrawn arrived at the palace with his loyal aide and translator, Ensign Eli Vanto, in tow. The pair had just come from a lavish gathering of Imperial elites, a rare occasion where Thrawn allowed himself to mingle with the upper echelons of the Empire. The event had been a spectacle of excess, with new and exotic drinks flowing freely among the attendees. Thrawn, ever the strategist, had partaken in a new, expensive concoction, a drink as rare as it was potent. Now, as they approached this urgent meeting in the Imperial Palace, Vanto noticed that the usually unflappable Chiss was slightly off balance, his steps just a touch slower, his demeanor slightly more relaxed than usual. Vanto couldn't shake his own unease. Being dragged into this clandestine meeting by Thrawn was unnerving enough, but seeing his superior affected by that drink only heightened his discomfort. It was as if the universe was conspiring to throw everything into disarray at once. The door to a war room in the palace where the meeting was set to take place hissed open, revealing the cold, sterile chamber within. Darth Vader stood near the window, his dark silhouette outlined against the lights of Coruscant below. His heavy breathing filled the room, a constant, menacing presence. Grand Moff Tarkin was already seated at the table, his sharp eyes narrowing as Thrawn and Vanto entered. "Grand Admiral, Ensign," Tarkin greeted with a nod, his tone clipped, betraying no emotion. "I trust you understand the gravity of the situation." Thrawn inclined his head, his red eyes glowing softly, but Vanto noticed a slight delay in his response, a rare lapse in the Chiss's usually precise timing. "Indeed, Grand Moff, the Emperor's condition has become a critical threat to the stability of the Empire. We must act decisively," Thrawn finished. Vanto, feeling like a bantha in a Gundark fight, shifted uncomfortably as he stood beside Thrawn. Eli then noticed how Thrawn's intense red eyes seemed to dart around the room, first landing on Vader. Thrawn's gaze lingered on the Dark Lord, attempting to pierce through the mask, but there was little to discern beyond the steady rhythm of mechanical breathing. Quickly, Thrawn's focus moved to Tarkin. The Grand Moff stood with military rigidity, his posture betraying nothing but control. But Thrawn's eyes were not easily fooled. He began his analysis, picking apart the tiny details most would miss, the way the tendons in Tarkin's neck tensed just slightly, the controlled but shallow breaths, the faint clenching of his jaw. The Chiss then made the following analysis mentally. The tension in the neck, a sign of unease, perhaps wary of Vader's unpredictable nature in these discussions. His breathing, shallow yet controlled, indicates a forced composure, likely masking deeper anxieties. The jaw clenching, possibly a reaction to the constraints of the situation, knowing that direct action against the Emperor is treasonous. The room was otherwise silent, save for Vader's mechanical breathing, but there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere as Tarkin's eyes flicked to Vader. A subtle furrow appeared on Tarkin's brow, his usual impassivity wavering for a moment. "Grand Admiral," Vader's voice cut through the silence, his tone holding a weight of suspicion, yet it was unclear what had prompted it. Thrawn continued, almost oblivious to Vader's questioning tone, his mind still processing every minute detail about Tarkin, which went as follows. Tarkin's posture, rigid yet betraying an undercurrent of stress, indicative of someone under immense pressure. Perhaps he's grappling with the implications of our conversation. The slight flicker of his eye. "Admiral," Vader interrupted again, this time with more force, but Thrawn's train of thought seemed unstoppable. The eyelid movement indicative of stress, likely compounded by, "Sir," Eli Vanto suddenly interjected, his voice low but urgent, snapping Thrawn out of his analysis. You're talking out loud, Eli said. A brief pause filled the room, a moment of realization sinking in as Thrawn's piercing red eyes met Vanto's. Then, in a display of his usual composed demeanor, Thrawn nodded slightly, acknowledging the unintended slip. "My apologies, gentlemen," he said smoothly, his voice now deliberately controlled. "It appears I may have underestimated the effects of the drink I consumed earlier this evening," Thrawn said, his voice calm and measured despite the admission. He gracefully took a seat at the table, his movements as deliberate as ever. Eli Vanto hesitated for a moment before a subtle nod from Tarkin prompted him to sit down as well. Despite the oddity of the situation, Vanto couldn't help but notice that his presence here was accepted, even trusted. Tarkin and Vader didn't view him as a threat to their plans. Thrawn's trust in him had earned him that much. Vader, his mask facing forward, leaned slightly toward the table, signaling the meeting was about to begin in earnest. "The Emperor's deteriorating condition," Vader began, his voice cold and unwavering, "has brought us to the brink of chaos. His commands grow more erratic by the day, threatening the stability of the Empire. We must determine a course of action." Tarkin, ever the pragmatic, was the first to respond. "The situation is indeed dire. The Emperor's paranoia has led to some peculiar orders." He leaned back slightly, as if considering how best to articulate the madness. "Just this past week, we received a directive to dispatch an entire battalion of stormtroopers to search for Jedi under his bed." Vader's masked face remained unreadable, but a slight pause in his breathing hinted at his disbelief. Tarkin continued, barely suppressing his own exasperation. "And then there was the order to install surveillance droids in every ventilation shaft on Coruscant to catch Jedi spies he's convinced are sneaking into the palace at night." Vanto raised an eyebrow at that one. But Tarkin wasn't done. Not to mention the decree he issued requiring every officer in the fleet to wear a Durafoil helmet during holobriefings, to block out Jedi mind tricks apparently. That particular order was thankfully intercepted before it could be disseminated. But it's only a matter of time before something equally ludicrous reaches the ranks. The absurdity of it all hung in the air for a moment, and despite the gravity of the situation, there was an undeniable sense of surrealism. Vader remained silent, but Tarkin's expression made it clear that these incidents were far from amusing to him. Thrawn, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly stood up. His movements were precise, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, it was in that same enigmatic tone that often left others either enlightened or utterly baffled. "Gentlemen," he began, "the situation we find ourselves in is not unlike the slow decay of a once mighty tree. Imagine, if you will, a tree standing tall and strong, its roots deep and its branches wide. From the outside, it appears invincible, a symbol of power and endurance." He paused, his red eyes scanning the room before continuing. "Yet, beneath the bark, a small rot begins to spread. It is slow, almost imperceptible at first, a minor flaw easily overlooked. But if left untreated, this rot seeps into the very heart of the tree, weakening it from within. The rot does not merely affect a single branch, it spreads through the roots, infecting every part of the tree, until it can no longer support its own weight. Eventually it collapses under its own diseased mass, a ruin of what it once was." Thrawn's voice was steady, almost hypnotic, as he made his analogy. "The Empire, in its current state, mirrors this tree. The Emperor, who once stood as its unassailable core, is now afflicted by a rot that threatens to bring the entire structure crashing down. If we do not act, if we do not address the root cause, then the Empire will fall, not from external forces, but from within." Vader and Tarkin exchanged puzzled glances, their expressions indicating they were trying to grasp the full meaning of Thrawn's words. They turned almost simultaneously to Eli, their faces a mix of confusion and expectation. Eli hesitated, his mind racing to translate Thrawn's philosophical musings into something concrete, something actionable. Thrawn, sensing his aide's hesitation, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You may speak freely, Ensign Vanto." Eli took a deep breath, his voice calm but resigned. "What Grand Admiral Thrawn is saying," he began, glancing briefly at Thrawn before continuing, "is that the Emperor's madness is the rot. It's already spread far enough that it threatens to destroy the Empire from within. If we don't do something to stop it, the Empire will collapse. And the only way to stop it, to cut out the rot entirely, is to..." He paused, the enormity of what he was about to say bearing down on him. But there was no way around it. Thrawn had given him the trust and the directive to speak plainly. "Thrawn is suggesting we kill the Emperor." Eli's words hung in the air like a death sentence. The room was dense with tension. the impact of what had just been spoken settling heavily on everyone present. Tarkin's eyes narrowed, his voice cold and clipped as he responded, "That is treason, Ensign. A thought that could bring down the Empire itself." Treason. Tarkin says the word with such finality, but his fingers twitch, a subtle tell. He's not dismissing the idea entirely. In his mind, he's already calculating the risks, weighing the potential outcomes. Tarkin's too pragmatic to ignore any possibility that could preserve the Empire's strength. And then Vader, he hasn't condemned the idea outright. That pause in his breathing, the slight hesitation, yes, there's doubt there. Vader, too, sees the cracks in the Emperor's facade. The hesitation speaks volumes. He knows the Emperor is no longer the leader he once was. Where there is doubt, there's room to maneuver. There's a way to... "Grand Admiral!" Vader's voice slices through the air. Thrawn blinks, his focus returning to the present, realizing with a start that he had been voicing his thoughts aloud once again. Eli, still seated, lets out a small sigh and glances at the wine bottle on the table, his expression resigned. Without a word, Tarkin pushes the bottle toward him, a silent gesture acknowledging the absurdity of the situation. Perhaps even the shared understanding that they are all in over their heads. As Eli poured himself a glass, Tarkin rose from his seat, his posture radiating authority. He turned to Vader, addressing the Sith Lord with a tone that carried the weight of years of command. "Lord Vader, the suggestion is indeed treasonous. But treason is a matter of perspective. If the Empire is to survive, we must consider all possibilities, however unthinkable they may seem." Thrawn, standing with his usual composed demeanor, began to speak once more, his voice calm and reflective. "Loyalty, gentlemen, is a complex concept. It is not merely a blind adherence to the figurehead of authority, but a commitment to the principles and the entity that authority represents. The Empire, in its essence, is a construct built upon the foundation of order, stability, and strength. Our loyalty, therefore, must not be to the individual who leads, but to the idea of the Empire itself." Eli took a long sip from his glass, his eyes glazing over as Thrawn continued. "When the head of a beast becomes infected, it threatens the life of the entire creature. To refuse to remove the rot, out of some misguided sense of loyalty to the infected part, is to commit treason against the whole. By allowing the Emperor's madness to persist unchecked, we are, in effect, betraying the Empire. We allow it to wither and die from within. There is no legal recourse, no avenue through which we can challenge the authority of the Emperor, for he has positioned himself as the absolute. Thus, our only path forward to ensure the survival of the Empire is to take the necessary action, to excise the rot at its source. What I am stating is simply the logical conclusion of our current predicament, translated into words that should resonate with our shared commitment to the Empire. The paradox of loyalty demands that we sever ties with the very figure to whom our oaths were sworn, in order to preserve the greater entity to which those oaths truly belong." As Thrawn finished, Tarkin and Vader exchanged another glance, their expressions a mixture of confusion and contemplation. They turned to Eli, who was now resolutely downing the bottle. With a deep sigh, Eli set the bottle down and looked at them both. "He's saying that by not killing the Emperor, we're the ones committing treason against the Empire because we're letting it fall apart. There's no legal way to remove him, so killing him is the only option." The simplicity of Eli's translation cut through the fog of Thrawn's philosophical musings, bringing the stark reality of the situation into sharp focus. Tarkin's gaze shifted to Vader, searching for any sign of hesitation, but the Sith Lord was already turning away, his helmeted head slowly angling towards the window. Outside, Coruscant's artificial weather system, a complex network of orbital satellites designed to regulate the planet's climate, had triggered a storm. The sky was alive with flashes of lightning, the rain hammering against the vast cityscape below. Thrawn glanced at his chrono. The slight movement seemed to carry the sense of inevitability. "Since we are all clearly in agreement," he began, "the probable conclusion of this meeting is the death of the Emperor. There is no reason to delay. I already have a plan in mind." Vader remained turned towards the window, the brilliant flashes of lightning reflecting off the polished surface of his black helmet. "What plan, Grand Admiral?" Vader asked, his voice devoid of emotion, the question hanging in the air like the tension before a storm. Thrawn's red eyes flicked back to the room as he turned on his heel, his hands folded neatly behind his back. "I will reveal it once we are within the Emperor's chambers," he stated, his tone final, brooking no argument. He began to walk toward the door, his footsteps echoing with purpose. "Come, I cannot do this alone." Tarkin and Vader exchanged one last look, a silent acknowledgement of the path they were about to tread. With a shared resolve, they fell into step behind Thrawn. Eli, now clearly drunk, grabbed the bottle of expensive wine and stumbled to his feet. He was far beyond caring about the seriousness of the situation. his senses dulled by the alcohol. Yet, he still followed, his loyalty to Thrawn outweighing any sense of self-preservation. As they moved through the darkened corridors of the palace, Tarkin leaned slightly towards Vader. "What do you think Thrawn is planning?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. Vader, still staring ahead, replied with a cryptic tone, "The Force will show us the way." Eli, struggling to keep up and swaying slightly, couldn't help but interject with a slurred, almost bemused translation. Of Vader, not Thrawn. He has no clue, just, going with the flow or something. Tarkin cast a sideways glance at the drunk ensign, but said nothing. They soon emerged into the vast corridor leading to the Emperor's private chambers. The walk would have looked like a slow-mo march, each step heavy with intent and finality. Thrawn led the way, his posture immaculate, hands clasped behind him in his usual calculated stance. His blue skin, contrasting against the dark, polished walls, made him appear almost spectral, a harbinger of what was to come. Tarkin and Vader walked side by side, the Grand Moff's face set in a mask of icy resolve, while Vader's black armor gleamed under the occasional flashes of lightning from the storm outside. Each lightning strike reflected off the surface of Vader's helmet, and as the light passed through his visor, it briefly illuminated the twisted remnants of the man underneath, the scarred yellow eyes and the burned skin around them, hidden from the world, yet all too visible in those fleeting moments. Eli stumbled alongside Tarkin, still clutching the wine bottle, now half empty. His movements were less precise, more erratic, but his loyalty to Thrawn kept him moving forward. The wine's dull burn in his throat was a strange comfort in the midst of the impending violence. He was the only one not entirely in control, yet somehow he belonged in this twisted procession. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, the polished floors reflecting their images back at them, distorted and darkened. The sound of their footsteps echoed, each one a steady, rhythmic beat that matched the ominous atmosphere. The thunder outside rumbled in sync, as if the very planet itself was aware of the treachery unfolding within its core. Soon they reached the door to the Emperor's chamber. The massive doors loomed before them, a final barrier separating them from the frail, decaying figure who had once commanded the galaxy with an iron fist. Standing vigil were the Emperor's royal guards, their crimson armor stark against the dark walls. The guards crossed their force pikes in front of the door, a silent but firm command for the group to halt. Vader stepped forward, his presence a towering, ominous force. The guards, trained to obey without question, hesitated for the briefest of moments. But before they could react further, Vader raised his gloved hand, and in an instant, his will pressed upon their minds. With the subtle but undeniable power of a force suggestion, he commanded, "Open the door, stand guard, and let no one enter." The guards' resistance melted away as their minds succumbed to Vader's influence. Without a word, they uncrossed their pikes and moved to open the doors. As the doors creaked open, a wave of cold air swept out, carrying with it the stale scent of the Emperor's dark, oppressive presence. The guards stepped aside, their duty now to ensure that the act about to be committed would go uninterrupted. There was a time when Palpatine might have sensed such an approach, a time when his mind was sharp enough to perceive even the faintest tremor in the Force. But that time had passed, his senses were dulled, clouded by the madness that had consumed him, and now he remained oblivious to the four figures who walked into his chamber with the intention to end his life. Thrawn strode in first. Tarkin, Vader, and Eli followed, the burden of their actions hanging over them. Yet a strange sense of resignation, perhaps even confidence, settled over them, because they knew that Palpatine's mind was too far gone to comprehend what was about to happen, even if he saw them approach. The lightning continued to flash through the transparent windows of what was once the Jedi Council chamber, illuminating the room in stark, fleeting bursts of light. They entered the Emperor's private chamber, a dark, shadowy space where the once feared ruler of the galaxy now lay, frail and mumbling incoherently on his oversized bed. His voice, once so commanding, was now a mere whisper, a fragment of the power it once held. Thrawn's red eyes scanned the room, and without a word, he moved toward the bed. There, discarded and forgotten, lay a pillow, one that had likely been thrown aside in one of Palpatine's paranoid fits. Thrawn reached for it, and in one fluid motion, he stretched it out. As he did, fine particles of dust drifted into the air, suspended for a moment in the flickering light of the storm. In that instant, the full extent of Thrawn's plan became clear to the others. The simplicity, the cold efficiency of it all, the pillow, this was Thrawn's grand strategy. Eli stared at the pillow in Thrawn's hands, his mind drifting through the haze of alcohol to the stories he had heard about the Chiss. They were a people renowned for their tactical brilliance, their ability to see beyond the obvious, and to use whatever tools were at their disposal to achieve their goals. The pillow in Thrawn's grasp was the ultimate expression of that philosophy, a tool so simple, so unassuming, yet capable of achieving the most decisive of victories. The Chiss were truly something else, Eli thought. Tarkin, however, found his thoughts drifting back to his youth on Eriadu, to the brutal lessons imparted by his uncle, Jova Tarkin. Jova had been a survivalist who believed in forging strength through adversity, and the lessons young Wilhuff learned on the Carrion Plateau on Eriadu were etched deeply into his psyche. The Carrion Plateau, with its harsh, unforgiving terrain, was a place where Tarkin had learned the value of triumphing over nature, of imposing order on chaos. As Tarkin watched Thrawn prepare to carry out his plan, he couldn't help but reflect on the simplicity and effectiveness of the Grand Admiral's approach. Sometimes the most straightforward methods are the most effective, Tarkin mused, recalling the countless trials on the Carrion where the simplest tools and strategies often yielded the best results. Vader, meanwhile, stared at the scene unfolding before him, his thoughts not on the plan or its execution, but on the wine bottle still clutched in Eli's hand. The Sith Lord, entombed within the confines of his armor, could not indulge in such trivial comforts. Yet, in this moment, as the dark weight of their actions settled upon him, he found himself wishing for something as simple as a sip of that wine. But that was a luxury denied to him. The wine was something he could never experience again, much like so many other aspects of his former life. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a Dark Lord of the Sith, wishing for a taste of something so insignificant, while they stood on the precipice of ending an era. All went silent as Thrawn approached the Emperor's bedside, the pillow gripped firmly in both of his hands. The air in the room felt thick, weighed down by the tension of what was about to happen. Palpatine lay on the bed, his once powerful form reduced to a frail, mumbling figure. His scarred skin, marred by the lightning that had backfired during his battle with Mace Windu, appeared ghostly in the dimly lit chamber. Each flash of lightning from the storm outside partially illuminated the deep lines etched into his face, the result of years of dark power, corruption, and decay. Thrawn's movements were purposeful as he stepped closer. His red eyes locked onto the pitiful form of the man who had once commanded the galaxy. The Grand Admiral raised the pillow with precise, measured intent, bringing it slowly over Palpatine's face. The Emperor continued to mumble incoherently, his eyes closed, unaware of the death that loomed above him. But just as Thrawn was about to press down, a sound pierced the oppressive silence. Mithrao Narodo. Thrawn froze, the pillow hovering just inches above Palpatine's face. The room fell into a stunned silence as all eyes turned towards the source of the voice. Even Vader, the unflinching enforcer, stood paralyzed, his breath coming in measured, mechanical rhythms. Slowly, Thrawn pulled the pillow away, revealing the Emperor's eyes, open, cold, and piercing, fixed directly on him. It was a gaze filled with an intensity that sent a chill through the room, freezing even Vader in place. "Emperor?" Thrawn asked, his voice steady but tinged with a rare uncertainty. "The Jedi are taking over," Palpatine yelled, his voice suddenly strong and filled with a manic energy. His eyes darted around the room, wild and filled with a deep-seated paranoia. "Grand Admiral, they are taking over. They... Yoda. He's in the vents beneath my bed. Look under there. He's there." The Emperor's voice broke into a panicked plea as his gaze fell on Vader. "Please don't let him kill me, Lord Vader," he pleaded, his voice trembling as he spoke. The words clearly directed at the vision of Yoda he believed was there. Vader, his mechanical breathing the only sound in the room, slowly kneeled beside the bed. His voice was soft, almost soothing, as he spoke. "Master, Yoda is not under the bed. There is no one there." Tarkin exchanged a glance with Vader, then looked at Eli, who stood frozen, still clutching the wine bottle, unsure of how to process the scene before him. Thrawn's grip on the pillow tightened momentarily, but he remained composed, his mind rapidly adapting to the unexpected turn. Palpatine's wild eyes returned to Thrawn, his voice pleading. "Admiral, you must stop them. They are taking over." "Yes, Emperor," Thrawn replied, his voice as calm and reassuring as ever. "They are indeed attempting to take over. The Jedi have launched an assault on Coruscant as we speak. They have mobilized entire battalions to strike at the heart of the Empire, and they are intent on overthrowing your rule." Palpatine's eyes widened, his fear palpable. "The Jedi, they are attacking?" "Yes, Emperor," Thrawn continued, his tone now filled with a sense of urgency. "But do not fear. We are already countering their attack. The Imperial forces are mobilizing across the city to repel the invaders. The Jedi are being driven back, and soon their efforts will be crushed. We will ensure that the Jedi do not take over." Palpatine's breathing grew more labored as he struggled to grasp the situation. You must execute order. Execute. His voice faltered, his strength waning as the words slipped away. And then, his eyes rolled back, and he passed out, his body going limp on the bed. Thrawn remained unmoved. "Yes, execute," he said quietly. He prepared to act again, but as he stepped forward, he felt the effects of the drink from the earlier gathering surge through him. His balance wavered, the usually sharp clarity of his mind now fogged, his movements less precise. Thrawn, always in control, realized with a rare admission that he would need assistance. He turned back to the others, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. "It seems the drink has impaired my faculties more than anticipated. One of you will need to finish this task." Tarkin and Vader exchanged glances, both of them hesitant. But before either could speak, Eli set down the wine bottle with a clumsy thud and stepped forward, a drunken determination in his eyes. "I'll do it," Eli slurred, his voice filled with a strange mix of resolve and intoxication. "I know a thing or two about strangling things to death," he smirked, though it was unclear whether he meant it as a joke or if there was some truth behind his words. "Interesting," Thrawn mused, his gaze focused on Eli as he handed him the pillow. Eli took it with a slight wobble, then stumbled slightly towards Palpatine's bed, his steps uneven but his mind set. Reaching the bed, Eli muttered under his breath, "My parents will be proud of me now," though whether he truly believed it or if it was the alcohol talking was unclear. He soon stood over the sleeping Emperor and brought the pillow over his face. And then, with a deep breath, he pressed the pillow down. The Emperor's eyes shot open, wide with fear and shock as he realized what was happening. His body jerked violently, instinctively fighting against the smothering force. Palpatine's arms flailed, trying to push the pillow away. Thrawn, realizing the need for additional restraint, stepped forward, his usually graceful movements hindered by the effects of the drink. He knelt at the foot of the bed, gripping both of Palpatine's legs tightly, holding them down with firm pressure. Vader moved quickly to assist, his imposing form standing at the side of the bed. He shifted his stance, trying to maneuver around Eli, who was struggling to keep Palpatine subdued. The drunken haze in Eli's mind cleared just enough for him to realize what Vader was attempting. In a sudden burst of clarity, Eli jumped onto the bed, putting all his body weight onto the pillow to make it easier for Vader to secure the Emperor's arms. Seizing the opportunity, Vader moved behind the bed and extended his metallic arms over the top, gripping Palpatine's flailing arms with unyielding strength to prevent any further resistance. Tarkin, standing off to the side, watched the chaotic scene unfold. But as Palpatine continued to resist, his survival instincts taking over, Tarkin knew they had to end this quickly. "Ensign, move aside for a second," Tarkin ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. Eli hesitated but then shifted his position slightly, just enough to allow Tarkin to act. Tarkin balled his hand into a fist and delivered a sharp, brutal punch to Palpatine's throat. The Emperor's body convulsed, his gasps turning to choked, desperate sounds. Eli, now with a renewed sense of purpose, kicked down onto the pillow with a savage force, driving it further into Palpatine's face. His drunken strength added to the pressure as he quickly resumed his position, pressing the pillow down with all his might, using both hands to smother the Emperor. Palpatine's body convulsed violently as he instinctively called upon the Force, his desperate plea reverberating through the room. Though his connection to the Force had weakened over the years, it still responded, albeit feebly. The bed began to levitate, trembling under the conflicting forces. Objects in the room, furniture, small artifacts, anything not bolted down, were yanked from their positions and hurled across the chamber, spinning wildly through the air as if caught in a fierce wind. Amid the chaos, Thrawn's voice cut through, still serene despite the madness unfolding around them. "Moff Tarkin," he said, his tone unshaken, "the Emperor's focus must be disrupted." Tarkin, understanding the necessity, swiftly unbuckled his belt. The polished leather slid free from his waist with a sharp crack. He wrapped it around his hand, then swung it with brutal precision, striking Palpatine's side with a resounding thwack. Again and again, the belt came down, each strike designed to disrupt the Emperor's concentration, to pull his mind away from the Force. Soon enough, as the strikes continued and Eli pressed the pillow down with increasing force, the bed began to lower. The levitation stopped altogether as the Force slipped from Palpatine's grasp, and with it, his life. Vader, attuned to the ebb and flow of the Force, felt the moment when the Emperor's presence flickered and then vanished entirely. He spoke with the finality of a death sentence. "Stop." Eli, grinning with drunken satisfaction, kicked the pillow one last time before getting up. Tarkin, ever composed, pulled the pillow away from Palpatine's lifeless face as Thrawn approached. The four men gathered around, staring down at the once all-powerful Emperor, now nothing more than a lifeless corpse. Thrawn, always thinking ahead, broke the silence. "It must look like an accident," he said. "We will make it appear as though the Emperor slipped, fell, and broke his neck." The others nodded in agreement. It was a simple plan, but it required careful execution. Each of them moved to their respective positions, grabbing hold of one of Palpatine's limbs. Thrawn took one leg, Vader the other, while Eli and Tarkin each grabbed an arm. The rain and lightning outside continued to rage, the storm mirroring the violence within the chamber. "On my signal," Vader instructed, his deep voice commanding as ever, though there was a strange undertone of something almost like anticipation. They began to swing the Emperor's body, building up momentum, the lifeless form swaying back and forth in a grim parody of motion. The plan was to hurl Palpatine's body toward the wall, making it seem as though he had hit it with enough force to cause a fatal injury. But as they swung, something went wrong. Perhaps it was the uneven coordination, or the drunken state of Eli, but when Vader gave the signal, the body veered off course. Palpatine's corpse flew through the air, but missed the intended wall. Instead, it hurtled toward a statue, a towering effigy of Sistros Nevet, one of the ancient rulers of the galaxy. The statue stood ominously in the corner of the room, and as Palpatine's body collided with it, there was a sickening crunch. The statue wobbled, teetering precariously, and then, as if in slow motion, it toppled over, crashing down directly onto Palpatine's head with a gruesome, final crunch. For a moment, the room was deathly silent, the only sound the continuing storm outside. Tarkin, his voice laced with exasperation, turned to Vader. "Why didn't you stop it?" "The statue," Tarkin asked calmly. Vader's helmeted head tilted slightly, the sound of his breathing the only indication of his presence. Then, in a tone that was oddly detached, he replied, "The Force, Moff Tarkin. It works in mysterious ways." The room again fell silent as they stood around the lifeless body of Emperor Palpatine. But that silence was abruptly shattered as the doors to the chamber swung open and the red-robed Imperial guards entered, their 4 spikes at the ready. The guards quickly took in the scene, the fallen statue, the lifeless body of Palpatine, crumpled beneath it. Their eyes narrowed behind their helmets as they pointed their pikes towards the 4 men standing over the corpse. "What happened to the Emperor?" one of the guards demanded, his voice cold and accusatory. Vader turned slightly, his imposing figure casting a long shadow across the room. He pointed at the body with a gloved hand, his voice devoid of any emotion. "He stumbled and fell," Vader said. The guards, however, did not lower their weapons. Their pikes remained raised, ready to strike. But before they could act, Thrawn stepped forward, his presence calm yet commanding. "What is your purpose in the Empire?" Thrawn asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. The guards hesitated for a moment before one of them replied, "Our purpose is to protect the Emperor." Thrawn nodded, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. "Then I trust you will do a better job protecting Emperor Vader than you did Palpatine," Tarkin interjected smoothly, stepping up beside Thrawn. Vader turned to face the guards fully. The room seemed to grow darker, the storm outside raging on as if heralding the dawn of a new era. The guards knelt before him, acknowledging the inevitable. Vader, now the undisputed ruler of the Empire, looked down at the kneeling guards, his mechanical breathing filling the chamber. And then they all lived happily ever after. Hopefully. But before you leave, if you want to get early access to these videos and other smaller videos that won't be uploaded to the channel anytime soon, like What If Jar Jar Became Darth Homelander, check out my Patreon, where you can get all that for $1 or more a month. Link should be in the description. Also, I would like to thank all the Patreon supporters and channel members who have helped me already. It really means a lot to me. Anyways, goodbye and see you in the next one. What if the Jedi Council filed the wrong tax form?